March 1945. Western Germany. The war was almost over, but in the sky, death still moved faster than thought. A lone P-47 Thunderbolt flew low over the Rhine, its left wing trembling, its engine coughing smoke. The pilot, Lieutenant Jack Weston, could feel the airframe groaning under him, a wounded beast limping toward home. The manifold pressure needle flickered below safe levels. Oil temperature climbing, fuel leaking. He was 20 miles from base, maybe less. Then, from the cloud line behind him, came the shimmer, silver, sleek, and quiet. A Messerschmitt Me-262. The jet was everything the Germans had promised. Smooth, effortless, perfect. Its twin engines howled like razors through the sky. In a straight line, nothing with a propeller could outrun it. Weston saw the glint and swore under his breath. He shoved the throttle forward, but the Thunderbolt barely responded. The damaged turbocharger hissed, choking on its own breath. The speed indicator crept past 300, then stalled. The jet was gaining fast. He could hear the rounds before he saw them, ripping the air around the cockpit, hammering the tail. The Me-262's 30mm cannons tore holes in the sky, missing by feet, but closing the gap with each burst. "Base, this is lead 2. I've got a jet on me. Engine's cooked. Can't shake him." Static. Then the voice of the crew chief. Calm, slow, familiar. "Jack, remember what I told you about the override?" Weston frowned. The override? No, that was impossible. The fix wasn't sanctioned. It wasn't even supposed to exist. He flipped a guarded switch under the throttle, the one marked intercooler. Locked. The lever fought him, stiff from the last flight. Then he shoved it forward until it clicked. The engine screamed. Every gauge on the dash went red. The prop wash brightened from blue to white. Weston felt the entire plane surge forward, not climbing, not diving, accelerating. The Me-262's pilot blinked. His rangefinder numbers suddenly flipped. The American was pulling away. At 420 miles per hour, the P-47 shouldn't have had any breath left. At 450, it should have melted. At 480, the engine began to glow. But it didn't stop. Weston gritted his teeth, every vibration rattling through his bones. The airframe howled, the dials danced. The jet behind him fired again, and missed. The chase inverted. For the first time in the war, a piston fighter was pulling distance from a jet. When Weston rolled hard left toward the clouds, the Me-262 overshot, too fast to react. The Thunderbolt's .850 caliber guns roared in unison. The jet's left engine burst into fire. Over the radio came one breathless voice, Carter, the mechanic, laughing like a man who'd just broken the law of physics. "Told you she'd run if you let her breathe." Weston didn't answer. He was too busy keeping the burning sky from tearing the wings off his plane. The Thunderbolt limped home smoking, its engine running well past every known limit. The ground crew stood silent when it landed, staring at the glowing exhaust pipes. It wasn't supposed to fly that fast. It wasn't supposed to survive. But that's what happens when one man decides that forbidden doesn't mean impossible. The P-47 had outrun a jet, and the fix that made it happen wasn't in any manual. By 1945, the word jet carried a kind of superstition. Allied pilots spoke it in the same tone they used for thunder or lightning, something too fast to fight, too strange to understand. The Messerschmitt Me-262 was the apex predator of the sky. In briefings, it was described not as a plane, but as a warning. If you see one, you won't have time to react. On paper, the numbers backed the fear. Top speed, 5 to 40 miles per hour. Acceleration unmatched. Armament, 4 30mm cannons that could shred bombers in seconds. Allied radar officers called them ghost blips. They appeared, struck, and vanished. The Luftwaffe called it Schwalbe, the swallow. It moved like one, too. Against that, the P-47 Thunderbolt looked ancient. A brute of rivets and steel, built for diving and punishment, not finesse. It was the heaviest single-engine fighter of the war, with a body like a flying anvil and the aerodynamics of a brick. But it had one virtue. It could take hits no other plane could survive. The Thunderbolt was less a bird and more a tank with wings. Still, when the Me-262s appeared over Germany, no one believed a piston plane could challenge them. Air intelligence bulletins listed strict avoidance tactics: brake low, scatter, and wait for the jets to run out of fuel. Nobody said anything about chasing them, but some men saw the math differently. Mechanics like Staff Sergeant Lewis Lou Carter didn't see the P-47 as obsolete. They saw it as untapped. They'd spent years elbow-deep in the R-2800 engine, learning its quirks and its limits. And they knew one truth that the rule books ignored. Every engine has more to give if you're willing to risk burning it alive. To Carter, the Me-262 wasn't unbeatable. It was a problem of acceleration versus endurance. The jets could sprint, but they couldn't sustain. Their Jumo 004 engines overheated in minutes, often seizing mid-flight. Carter had seen enough machines die under pressure to know that perfection has a price. He'd watched pilots return with half their gauges dead, their engines howling, and still alive. He'd seen men push the Thunderbolt past the red line and limp home smoking, but victorious. Every limit in the manual was written to protect the hardware, not the man. Carter believed the opposite. The machine existed to protect the man, and if bending the rules kept the pilot breathing, the rules could bend until they broke. So when the Me-262 arrived and command said you can't catch it, Carter didn't hear defeat. He heard a challenge. He knew the P-47's secret lay in its lungs, the turbo supercharger system that fed its monstrous double-wasp engine. It was complicated, delicate, and heavily restricted. Regulations forbade manual interference with the wastegate or intercooler. Too dangerous, they said. Too unpredictable. Carter saw that as an invitation. Because the truth about the Me-262 was simple. It was fast, but fragile. Its strength came from technology. Its weakness came from fear of losing it. The Germans had built a machine so advanced that even its pilots were told to handle it gently. Carter's philosophy was the reverse. His Thunderbolt could take abuse. If the system failed, the pilot might still live. That difference between reverence and recklessness was where victory hid. He began asking quiet questions. What happens if the wastegate stays open? What happens if you reroute the cooling ducts? What happens if the turbo spins past safe RPM? The answers were written nowhere. The manuals ended where imagination began. The jet war wasn't about who flew faster. It was about who dared to break first. And while the Luftwaffe trusted their engineers, the Americans had a few mechanics who trusted no one. Carter was one of them. The Me-262 had speed. He had nerve. And in the end, nerve outruns math. Before Carter ever broke a rule, the Thunderbolt was already a contradiction. A flying sledgehammer that shouldn't have worked, yet somehow ruled the sky. Weighing in at over 8 tons fully loaded, it was the heaviest single-engine fighter in the war. A brute force machine with an engine the size of a family car. The Pratt & Whitney R-2800 Double Wasp was its heart. 18 cylinders of explosive muscle, 2,000 pounds of aluminum, and fire designed to claw air itself into submission. But that power came with a curse. The R-2800's secret weapon, its turbo supercharger, made it both unstoppable and temperamental. The device sat in the belly of the plane, a mechanical lung that gulped in air, compressed it, and fed it to the engine at high altitude. It gave the P-47 a second wind where other fighters gasped. Yet it also made the aircraft a nightmare to maintain. Every flight demanded a dozen adjustments. Temperature, manifold pressure, fuel-air ratio, all had to stay in balance. If the turbo lagged or overheated, the whole system melted down. The Army's solution was bureaucracy. No one but factory technicians or depot engineers could touch the turbo controls. Every squadron received the same warning in bold red print. Do not modify supercharger linkage or intercooler settings under field conditions. To a rule follower, that sentence ended the conversation. To Carter, it was an insult. He'd been a race mechanic before the war, the kind of man who tuned engines by sound, not gauges. His fingers knew torque the way pianists knew keys. When he looked at the Thunderbolt, he didn't see a warplane. He saw a racing machine forced to crawl under paperwork. "Every engine's got 1 more mile an hour hiding in it," he liked to say. "You just have to know where the factory chickened out." The factory had chickened out plenty. Wartime production meant safety margins, regulators and governors that capped power to preserve lifespan. The Thunderbolt's turbocharger could safely run at 18,000 RPM. The same unit, ungoverned, could spin to 23,000. The limit wasn't physics, it was fear. Fear of the machine breaking before the war ended. Carter believed that fear was the only thing holding the P-47 back from the impossible. He'd seen what the airframe could take: flak holes, overheating, oil leaks, and still bring its pilot home. He called it the stubborn plane. Where other fighters disintegrated, the Thunderbolt limped back smoking, spitting, but alive. It had 8 50 caliber guns, self-sealing fuel tanks, and armor thick enough to survive a cannon hit. It wasn't graceful, but it didn't need to be. In a dive, it could hit 500 mph, faster than gravity wanted it to fall. Pilots joked it was a brick with wings, but bricks don't climb 30,000 feet and shoot down Focke-Wulfs. Still, the turbo supercharger remained its bottleneck. The system was built for reliability, not raw speed. It had automatic controls, wastegates, safety cutoffs, all there to keep men from breaking the engine. Carter saw the flaw. Safety controls couldn't tell the difference between fear and necessity. He started taking notes after every maintenance cycle, comparing heat patterns, boost levels, flight durations. One evening, he realized the obvious. The system could survive bursts of overboost as long as airflow stayed high enough to prevent detonation. He began designing a bypass switch, something simple, hidden, reversible. A single lever wired into the intercooler actuator, letting the pilot lock it in the open position. It would feed cold air directly into the turbo, forcing maximum boost pressure. Dangerous. Wasteful. Brilliant. It wasn't just a fix, it was a statement. Carter didn't trust the machine's limits because he didn't trust the men who wrote them. He wasn't trying to make a faster fighter. He was trying to prove that the P-47 could be something more than safe. He wanted to see what happened when the beast stopped holding back. And soon, he'd find out exactly what it looked like when an airplane learned how to break its own chains. Carter's modification wasn't magic. It was math, brutal and simple. Every piston engine hides a balancing act between heat, pressure, and power. Push one too far, and the other two turn on you. For the P-47, that balance was the line between flight and explosion. At standard combat settings, the R-2800 engine ran a manifold pressure of 52 inches of mercury, enough to produce around 2,300 horsepower. The Army allowed short bursts at 56 inches for war emergency power. But Carter had seen those numbers in tests at Wright Field. He knew the same engine could tolerate more, if you were willing to let it scream. He wired a simple switch into the supercharger wastegate, forcing it to stay fully open. Then he bypassed the intercooler's automatic governor so the pilot could flood cold air straight into the intake. The effect was immediate. Manifold pressure jumped to 65 inches, briefly touching 70 during acceleration. The torque curve spiked like a heart attack. The boost didn't just increase speed, it changed how the whole plane breathed. Carter measured the difference in climb rate. A stock P-47D could reach 30,000 feet in 11 minutes. His forbidden fix cut that to 7.8. The numbers looked fake on paper, so he repeated the test with another pilot. Same result. The turbo whined like a banshee, the propeller blur thickened into a white disk, and the engine produced roughly 2,750 horsepower, nearly 20% beyond design limit. That power came at a price. Cylinder head temperature rose past 260 degrees Celsius within 90 seconds. Oil pressure wavered. The turbine blades glowed faint red. The coolant couldn't keep up. Every second overboosted was eating life out of the metal. Carter estimated 4 minutes of use before structural failure. He called it 4 minutes of God. To understand what he'd done, imagine a human sprinting at full tilt while swallowing air through a fire hose. The lungs don't burst immediately, they just start to tear from the inside out. That's what overboost was. Raw power through self-destruction. Every limit he bypassed had been written for a reason. Engineers knew that once the wastegate locked open, the turbo spun faster than its bearings could safely handle. Once the intercooler was forced into maximum flow, back pressure turned erratic. The system became a living thing, furious, unpredictable, unstoppable. But Carter wasn't guessing. He knew the R-2800's metallurgy better than the men who built it. He knew how far the pistons could stretch before friction seized them, how long valves could glow before they cracked. "Steel's like a man," he told Weston one night over coffee. "It'll take pain if you ask it the right way." The pilot laughed. "What happens if I ask too loud?" Carter smiled. "Then it stops listening." When he finished wiring the override into Weston's plane, he added one line in pencil on the instrument panel. "Emergency boost, 4 minutes max." He didn't know that line would soon become legend. Because the first time Weston pulled that switch in combat, the numbers didn't just rise. They broke. At 70 inches manifold pressure, the Thunderbolt leapt forward like it had been kicked by God. Fuel consumption doubled, turbo RPM climbed past 23,000, and airspeed passed 500 mph in level flight. No piston plane had ever gone that fast and lived. The math said the engine should have failed after 120 seconds. It ran for 280. That wasn't just an improvement, it was an act of defiance. The overboost fix worked because Carter didn't believe in limits. He believed in margin, those few hidden inches of pressure that separate destruction from discovery. He wasn't chasing perfection. He was chasing the edge of physics. And soon, he'd get to see what happened when that edge bit back. It began as a gamble, not a mission, not an order. Just two men standing on a rain-slick runway in England, staring at a crippled Thunderbolt that everyone else had written off. The aircraft, tail number 276445, nicknamed Roxy Bell, had returned from a sortie with half its turbo feed shredded by shrapnel. Command tagged it, grounded for parts. Carter saw a challenge. He crouched under the cowling, flashlight between his teeth, tracing the twisted metal lines. The supercharger wastegate actuator was gone. The intercooler governor, damaged. Most mechanics would have filled out a form and walked away. Carter didn't believe in paperwork when adrenaline was cheaper. He turned to his assistant, Corporal Diaz. "If we're going to lose her anyway, might as well see what she's hiding." By midnight, the fix was done. A length of copper wire, a hand-cut bypass, and a toggle switch soldered directly into the throttle assembly. It looked crude, even dangerous, because it was. He tested the switch once. The turbo spun up with a howl that shook the entire airframe. The pressure gauge twitched past 65 inches before Carter killed it. The engine coughed and hissed but didn't explode. He grinned. "She's angry, but she's alive." When Lieutenant Jack Weston found out the next morning, he nearly lost his mind. "You hot-wired a warplane? Lou, they'll hang us for that." Carter just wiped his hands and said, "Only if it doesn't work." They tested it that afternoon. Weston climbed into Roxy Bell while Carter stood 50 yards away with his clipboard and a cigarette that burned faster than usual. The air smelled like rain and burnt oil. That mix of fear and invention only war can make. "Engine check 1, Weston called. The propeller roared to life, blades flashing silver. "Boost normal, 52 inches. Now throw the switch." The turbo screamed like a banshee waking up. The ground vibrated. The pressure needle jumped to 65. Carter's cigarette fell from his lips. "Holy hell," Weston whispered. "Keep her steady," Carter shouted over the roar. The plane lurched forward, wheels skidding against wet tarmac. At 80 knots, Weston yanked the stick and the Thunderbolt clawed into the sky. He felt the weight vanish, like the machine had been holding its breath for years, and finally exhaled. 10,000 feet came in 2 minutes, 15,000 in under 5. The radio cracked with static and laughter. "Lou, I think she's trying to leave the Earth." Carter's pencil shook as he jotted down readings. "Temperature? Climbing fast. Oil's in the red. Pull back in 30 seconds. I'm not done yet." He stayed up for nearly 4 minutes. When he landed, the engine was boiling, oil pressure 0, exhaust pipes glowing orange. But it was still running. Carter met him on the runway, grinning like a thief caught in daylight. "Well?" Weston laughed, disbelief and terror in the same breath. "You built a monster." They didn't file the modification report. Officially, the plane was still under maintenance. But word spread through the 56th Fighter Group within hours. Pilots started asking questions in whispers. "Did it really climb like that? Is it true you rewired the supercharger? What's the limit?" Carter answered every question with the same line. "Don't use it unless you plan to die anyway." To him, the fix wasn't just a machine trick, it was philosophy. The system said follow the manual. He said the manual doesn't bleed. That night, Weston wrote in his flight log, "Engine felt alive, like it knew it shouldn't be doing this. 4 minutes of pure defiance." They both knew what they had created wasn't meant to exist. But when the war is ending and the rules are falling apart, sometimes the line between repair and rebellion disappears. And a crippled plane can become the fastest thing in the sky. Power in a piston engine isn't born, it's stolen. Stolen from the metal, from the fuel, from the seconds before everything disintegrates. Carter's forbidden fix lived in that stolen time. The physics were clear, cruel, and absolute. Every minute at full boost meant the turbine spun faster than its bearings could shed heat. Every second at overboost meant temperatures rose 20 degrees higher than the last. At 70 inches of manifold pressure, the R-2800 wasn't an engine. It was a bomb with propellers. Carter had calculated the line. 4 minutes. That was all the time the metal could endure before its crystal structure, stressed by vibration and molten oil, collapsed in on itself. But to a pilot under fire, 4 minutes might as well have been eternity. He wrote it down on the side of the throttle quadrant in grease pencil. 4 minutes to glory. To test his math, they did it again, this time higher. 15,000 feet, clean air, cool temperatures. Weston leveled out and threw the switch. The gauges spun to the right like dials possessed. Manifold pressure 70. RPM 2,800. Fuel flow doubled. Carter's stopwatch clicked. First minute, fine. Second minute, smooth. Third minute, smoke. By 3.5, oil temperature was near 300 degrees Celsius. Coolant, past safe limits. The turbo was howling so loud that the radio became useless. Then Weston throttled back. The engine coughed once, twice, then settled. 4 minutes. Exactly as predicted. On the ground, Carter inspected the engine. Exhaust stacks blistered, spark plug threads half melted, but nothing had failed. The propeller bearings looked like they'd been through hell. He smiled and muttered, "Good girl." But the danger wasn't the engine dying. It was what would happen if the pilot didn't. Every overboost cycle warped the turbine blades a little more, stretched the cylinder heads a little thinner. One mechanic described it best. "It's like bending a coat hanger. You can do it a few times before it snaps." The Thunderbolt could handle a few miracles. It just couldn't handle them forever. Within a week, Carter's fix had been whispered across 3 squadrons. Some tried copying it. Some got away with it. Some didn't. One plane caught fire at altitude when the fuel pump overpressurized. Another lost its turbo mid-climb and fell out of the sky. Command started hearing rumors. hot-wired turbos, rogue mechanics, runaway P-47s. They launched quiet inspections, pretending not to know whose fingerprints were on every wire. Carter didn't deny it. "You tell me not to let our boys die," he told one officer. "So I don't." What he never said was that he had already run the numbers to their end. At 72 inches manifold pressure, the turbine wheel would hit resonance, tearing itself apart at 25,000 RPM. The shrapnel wouldn't stay inside the housing. It would scythe through the fuselage like a buzzsaw. He'd drawn it out in his notebook, neat pencil lines showing the burst radius. The calculation was labeled catastrophic mode, do not attempt. The irony, of course, was that someone would. Carter had built a weapon too powerful to survive its own use. Every time a pilot threw that switch, he was gambling the engine's life against his own, and in that equation no one knew which side would win. But war doesn't stop for safe numbers. When a Me-262 appeared on radar 2 days later, heading straight for Weston's patrol, the gamble was no longer theoretical. The forbidden fix would either make history or end it. 4 minutes. That was the deal. 4 minutes to live like a god, or to die like one. March 18th, 1945. Altitude 22,000 feet. Sky clear, horizon blood orange. Lieutenant Jack Weston and his wingman were flying east of the Rhine when the warning came through the headset. "Bandits inbound, high 2 o'clock, fast, very fast." Every pilot in Europe knew what that meant. Me-262s. They were supposed to be ghosts. Strike, vanish, untouchable. Weston's Thunderbolt was flying at full military power, just under 400 miles per hour, and he could already feel the air tremble from something faster slicing through it. The first pass was a blur. The German jet screamed overhead so close it rocked Weston's cockpit, a sound like tearing fabric. Then silence. The Me-262 curved away into the sun, climbing for another run. Its pilot, Oberleutnant Erich Vollmer, had downed 4 bombers that week. To him, piston fighters were quarry, not combatants. Weston's wingman shouted, "Brake! He's looping back!" The jet dove, sunlight flashing off its silver fuselage. Weston snapped into a roll, the tracers of 30mm fire ripping through the space he'd just left. He leveled out and yanked the throttle forward, but the damaged turbo lagged, coughing and gasping like a dying animal. Then he saw the switch. Carter's forbidden fix, still wired beneath the throttle. A small metal lever painted black, emergency boost, 4 minutes max. He hesitated for half a breath, then flipped it. The turbo roared like a demon. The manifold pressure shot past 60, 65, 70. The P-47 didn't just accelerate, it lunged. The whole airframe shuddered, gauges rattling, the canopy vibrating so hard he thought it might shatter. The propeller blurred into a white halo. Vollmer noticed too late. He'd lined up for another strafing run, expecting a slow target. Instead, the American fighter beneath him suddenly grew smaller, not because he was pulling away, but because Weston was closing the distance. The Thunderbolt was climbing, chasing, hunting. At 480 miles per hour, the air became a liquid wall. Weston's arms ached from the stick's resistance. Every vibration felt like it would tear his bones apart. But the engine kept screaming, the sound higher than it had any right to go. "Come on, baby," he muttered. "Stay together." The Me-262 broke into a shallow turn, confident that no piston aircraft could follow. But Weston's P-47 didn't obey that rule anymore. He rolled hard and pulled through the curve, G-forces crushing his chest. He lined up the Pipper. Range, 300 yards. The Thunderbolt's 850 caliber Brownings opened up, sending a river of fire into the jet's tail. For a second, nothing. Then a burst of orange light as tracer rounds found the engine. Vollmer's Me-262 flared into flame. One of the turbines disintegrated mid-spin. The jet spiraled down, leaving a trail of black smoke across the golden sky. Weston's plane kept climbing, overshooting its own victories. He cut the throttle and flipped the switch back. The power vanished like someone had pulled his heart out. The engine coughed, sputtered, and settled into a rough idle. He looked down through the canopy, watching the burning wreck hit the ground far below. His hands were shaking so hard he could barely grip the stick. "Base, this is Lead 2, he radioed, voice cracking. "Confirm one Me-262 down, and tell Lou his monster works." Static, then laughter. "Copy that, Jack. You just rewrote physics." He didn't answer. He was too busy praying the plane wouldn't die before he reached home. The temperature gauges were still climbing, oil pressure bleeding away, the prop wash sputtering unevenly. The Thunderbolt limped westward, trailing smoke like a comet with one last streak of life. When he touched down at base, Carter was waiting. The plane rolled to a stop. The engine seized and the propeller froze mid-turn. Carter ran his hand along the scorched cowl, whispering to himself, "She did it." Weston climbed out, soaked in sweat. "You owe that engine an apology," he said, grinning weakly. Carter looked at the melted turbo fins, the cracked exhaust, the faint smell of burned oil still hanging in the air. "No," he said softly. "She owed us this one." Somewhere behind them, the setting sun caught the silver gleam of the wreckage still burning over Germany. The Me-262 was supposed to be untouchable, until a broken Thunderbolt proved otherwise. When Roxy Bell rolled into the maintenance hangar that night, the air smelled like melted metal and victory. Ground crews swarmed around her, floodlights cutting through the steam. The engine ticked as it cooled, every pop a heartbeat fading out. Carter stood motionless, eyes tracing the damage. Exhaust manifolds glowing orange. Turbo casing warped like a pretzel. Oil thick as tar dripping from the cowling. A normal inspection checklist would have needed a priest, not a mechanic. He wiped the soot from the data plate and whispered, 505 miles an hour. It wasn't just a number. It was sacrilege. The plane had gone faster than any Thunderbolt was ever meant to fly. Faster than most engineers believed a piston engine could push air. Then came the officers, clipboard men, regulations made flesh. They didn't share Carter's awe. Captain Raymond Cole from Group Maintenance led the team. "You rewired a U.S. Army aircraft without authorization?" Carter didn't flinch. "I made her run when everyone else said she couldn't. You endangered equipment and personnel. I saved both." The captain's jaw tightened. "You also melted a $200,000 engine." Carter shrugged. "And traded it for a German jet." No one laughed. Paperwork doesn't find heroism funny. Cole ordered a full teardown. Within hours, the mechanics pulled the turbo apart. The bearings had fused to the shaft. The turbine blades were cracked like glass. Half the cylinder heads were warped, 2 pistons scored nearly through. The fact that the engine hadn't exploded mid-flight bordered on miracle. One tech stared at the damage in disbelief. "She shouldn't have survived a minute of that." Carter smiled faintly. "She didn't know she wasn't supposed to." He was written up for unauthorized field modification. Weston was grounded pending review. But before the ink dried, a coded message arrived from Wright Field, the Air Technical Service Command's nerve center. The note was short, unsigned, and deliberately vague. "Forward all data and field observations on non-standard overboost procedure. Further tests authorized under controlled conditions." Cole read it twice, scowled, and folded it away. "Looks like someone upstairs wants your madness in a lab." A week later, engineers in Ohio were replicating Carter's setup on test stands. The results matched almost exactly. Massive power increase, catastrophic engine wear, no immediate failure. They logged it as emergency power phase 3 and quietly filed it under restricted circulation. Carter never saw the report, but word got back through the grapevine. A friend in logistics wrote, "They're calling it controlled overboost. No credit, of course. You're a rumor with a wrench." He didn't care. When Weston's court-martial notice arrived, it came with an unexpected witness request. The officer assigned to testify wasn't a judge. It was a civilian engineer from Pratt & Whitney. In the cramped hearing room, the man adjusted his glasses and said, "This mechanic achieved results our design bureau considered physically impossible without engine failure. The fact that it didn't detonate suggests we underestimated our own machine." Silence. Then slowly the charges evaporated. No commendation, no reprimand, no mention of what really happened. Just a new line in the flight manuals. Quietly added weeks later. Prolonged war emergency power may be used under combat conditions at pilot discretion. Carter's forbidden fix had become official procedure, rewritten in bureaucratic language, sterilized of his name. When Weston returned to flight status, he found a replacement P-47 waiting. The new model had a reinforced turbo assembly and thicker turbine blades. Inside the cockpit, a fresh label under the throttle read, "Emergency boost, 5 minutes max." He laughed until his eyes stung. Carter watched him take off one last time from the muddy strip. As the plane roared into the gray sky, the mechanic muttered, "Guess she learned to run after all." Behind him, Roxy Bell sat stripped and silent, her engine removed, her frame scarred with history no one dared to record. Machines die, rules bend. But the sound they left behind, that impossible scream of a propeller catching a jet, would haunt the men who heard it for the rest of their lives. Because deep down, everyone on that airfield knew the truth. The price of defiance isn't failure. It's being right too soon. In the official records, nothing extraordinary happened that March day. No mention of forbidden wiring, no reference to a Thunderbolt chasing down a jet. The report simply read, "One Me-262 destroyed, engine malfunction, aircraft lost." The language of bureaucracy always finds a way to bury miracles. But among the pilots, the story spread like wildfire. Men whispered about the Thunderbolt that outran a jet, about a mechanic who'd hotwired his own legend. They called it Carter's charge, the 4-minute fix, or simply the madness. Each retelling grew faster, louder, more impossible. Some said the plane hit 520 mph before the engine seized. Others swore the pilot flew through his own shockwave. The truth was simpler and far more dangerous. Carter's forbidden fix didn't just give one plane a burst of power. It had exposed the flaw at the heart of modern warfare, the belief that safety and victory could coexist. The engineers wanted predictable machines. The soldiers needed unpredictable ones. Between those two desires lay the line between genius and treason. To the Army, Carter was a liability. To the pilots who owed him their lives, he was proof that courage and engineering were the same thing when stripped of rules. In the months after the war, fragments of his idea reappeared in every new piston aircraft. Manual intercooler overrides, adjustable wastegates, short-duration power settings. The P-51H Mustang, the F-8F Bearcat, the Sea Fury, all carried echoes of his defiance. Each came with a new term stamped in red letters on the throttle quadrant. WBEP, War Emergency Power. That was the sanitized name for what Carter had done. It sounded official, scientific, controllable. But everyone who had ever thrown that switch knew what it really was. Permission to burn your machine for one last miracle. WBEP was 4 minutes of borrowed time, the space between regulation and rebellion, the difference between a dead pilot and a smoking, victorious wreck limping home on fumes. When engineers at Wright Field later examined Carter's melted engine, one of them wrote in the margin of the test report, "Stress endurance exceeded by 183 seconds. Operator judgment critical." Operator judgment, a bureaucrat's way of describing instinct. That instinct, the ability to trust human nerve over mechanical fear, is what turned the tide of the air war. It's what let farm boys and grease-stained mechanics rewrite the limits of aviation with nothing but a wrench, a wire, and too much courage. Carter was never decorated, never thanked. The Air Corps couldn't afford to reward heresy. But years later, in an obscure technical conference, one test pilot would say quietly to a room full of engineers, "The P-47 was the first American aircraft that learned how to break its own rules." No one in that room knew the name of the man who taught it. But the legacy of that moment, The hum of a piston engine chasing a jet across a dying sky never faded. It lived on in the logic of every pilot who looked at the red line and decided to cross it anyway. Because at the edge of destruction lies the truth every mechanic understands. The line between genius and treason is drawn in melted metal, and sometimes to outrun the future, you have to set the present on fire. After the war, the airfields emptied, and the roar of engines gave way to the hum of peacetime. The Thunderbolts that had clawed through Europe were melted down for scrap or parked in quiet museums, their scars polished away. But every once in a while, one of the old ground crews would stop by an exhibit, stand before a P-47's nose, and whisper a name the placard never carried: Lou Carter. He went home to Indiana in 1946 with a busted wrist, a discharge form, and a head full of noise. He opened a small auto garage beside the highway. Locals brought him their broken cars, their stubborn engines, their hopeless cases, and somehow the machines always left his shop running. He never used manuals, never read specs. He tuned by ear, by feel, by faith. If a customer asked him how he made a wreck come back to life, he'd shrug and say, "Every engine wants to run. You just gotta convince it." In a rusted metal cabinet behind his workbench, he kept a single relic from the war, a charred turbo impeller, cracked clean through, still faintly discolored from heat. Sometimes, when the nights got quiet, he'd take it out, run a finger along its edge, and remember the sound, that impossible scream when air met fire and both refused to stop. He never told his family the full story. To his daughter, he was just a mechanic with grease on his hands and an odd habit of staring at the sky when jets passed overhead. In 1968, a letter arrived from an old pilot named Weston. Inside was a photo. Two young men beside a smoking Thunderbolt, both grinning like fools. On the back, Weston had written 5 words: "Still can't believe it flew." Carter hung the photo above his workbench. Customers thought it was just another picture of war. He knew better. The world remembered the Me-262 as the first jet fighter. It forgot the day a wounded piston plane, wired by a rebel mechanic, made the impossible chase and won. History loves perfection, but it's the mistakes that change everything. When Carter died in 1971, his tools were still laid out in neat rows. No medals, no commendations, just a man who once bent the laws of physics long enough for another man to live. Somewhere in a museum hangar today, one P-47 still carries a faint, almost invisible mark on its throttle. A hairline groove where a lever used to sit. The placard says, "Emergency boost." But the men who knew what it really meant called it something else. 4 minutes of God. Because those who were there never forgot what it felt like when the monster finally breathed, when the red line stopped being a warning and became a prayer. Rules make machines safe, but only defiance makes them alive. And for one brief moment in 1945, defiance outran a jet.